When we look at any city in India, and I will only talk about Mumbai for now, when we look at the city, often someone like me, who's disabled, not just as an activist, but a woman with a disability, I start wondering, okay, how was the city built? Was it built? Is the infrastructure, are the streets really made with the thought of someone with a diverse body, with some diversity actually in mind, or it's built for a set of people who we largely categorize as non-disabled people? And that was a very critical question that I grew up with as a young woman, a teenager turning blind in the city, but also as an activist now. And unfortunately, what I've seen through the years is that the approach that we have towards public space, towards streets, is that of a very healthy, able-bodied person who would be able to do everything perfectly. We don't even consider the children, the elderly, people with disabilities. Basically, we don't consider diversity at all. And that gives us a message. That gives a stronger message than anything else. That we're saying that public spaces are not spaces, streets are not spaces that belong to a certain group. And that probably is a bigger marginalization or a bigger problem than anything else. This silent messaging of this space doesn't belong to you. It need not belong to you, and we're okay with that. We're taking away of your right of being in public, of being seen, of moving around freely, of enjoying travel, of going to a space, of occupying parks, of doing all of that. So I think that's the biggest issue that we see when people who are into urban planning, infrastructural development, into construction, etc., have a very, very ableist lens towards their work. So we generally talk about, when we talk about disability and we talk about accessibility, the thing that comes to everyone's mind is, okay, let's make a ramp and things will be okay, right? The idea starts from there. It says, okay, we have a slope, we have a ramp, so our building's accessible. But we just forget, when I kept repeating diversity, I also meant just seeing how many different kinds of people engage with streets, engage with the public space, engage with the city at large. And so there are very small instances. A ramp doesn't mean accessibility. Putting just braille doesn't mean accessibility. It also means having signage for people who can't hear. So there are a couple of examples that I'll give you. One is from my own life. Is that I always tell people that it's easier for me to take a flight, travel to Delhi, to New York, to Brazil, to Vietnam for work, but it's extremely difficult for me to get to the corner store, to walk 10 minutes, to collect my laundry, to buy grocery from the grocer shop, to go vegetable shopping. It's just because, or even board a bus, because from my house to the bus stop, there is just no pedestrian space to walk. There are 2 crossings involved. There is no signage on the road, which can be identified by a person with visual impairment. I've also lived in London when I was pursuing my master's at the London School of Economics. And it was actually then that I realized how ableist the streets of Mumbai are. How they're built with a non-disabled idea. Because in London, I did exactly all what I've outlined now with a lot of ease. So when we talk about people with disabilities being visible, being independent, not being out there, and that's why their issues are not seen, or they're not independent and so they're not treated equally, the questions need to be asked to the non-disabled people who are making spaces non-inclusive, who are sort of not only not ready to get rid of barriers, but are also deliberately creating barriers by having this non-inclusive approach. What can be done? Very simple things can be done around infrastructure, around street access. And here I will bring a campaign that we've been running with a Mumbai-based non-profit point of view, where I am the program director of Sexuality and Disability, a program working for girls and women with disabilities. In this program, we have an annual campaign called My Access Campaign. During 16 days of ending gender-based violence, that's from 25th November to 10th December, which also comprises of 3rd December, which is the International Day of Persons with Disabilities. We think and we bring this intersection together. What does it mean to be a woman and occupy public spaces? What does it mean to be a woman with a disability and to occupy public spaces? So with this idea in mind, we started this campaign, which we thought we would run across disabilities and see and work together with non-disabled women. Now, when you work together with women with disabilities and women who are not disabled, you're basically bringing them together and saying, hey, look, we're all women first. And so what are our challenges as women in accessing public spaces? And then within this group, some women could be different. The entire group is diverse, but some women could have disabilities. So what does it mean? What does access mean for them? And I think while defining access, and this was very important because then we broke access down into two bits and we said access is safety plus accessibility. I can't access public spaces, I can't access the streets if they're not both of these. And what would safety then mean as a right for a woman, irrespective of whether she's disabled or not? Are the streets safe for me? Okay, what does safety mean for me? How would I negotiate with these spaces at night? How would I negotiate with crowds? And it was so interesting because in this campaign we realized that being a woman is a very common thread. I mean, we knew it, but it was also for groups with whom we worked, for them to realize and recognize that gender, or in this case being a woman, specifically brings these linkages of experiences where if you're a woman, crowded spaces could be challenging, but because of safety reasons. Where isolated spaces could be super challenging, again because of safety reasons. So basically the barrier to access public spaces is not how physically the public space is, but maybe how others are occupying it too, and what that means for you to occupy this public space, or how does that impact in you as a woman occupying this public space. It was terrific because responses were very common between women with and without disabilities, and we would, the question often is, woman without disability would have accessibility challenges. No, she would have accessibility challenges and safety challenges. A woman with a disability would have only accessibility challenges, but that's not true. She would have accessibility and safety challenges. Now, what happens to a woman without a disability? We always assume this one thing that, oh, you don't have a disability, you can sort of walk through broken roads, you can do anything, it's okay for you not to have a pedestrian way to stop, to cross, etc. But that's not true again. So we feel that if there's a woman without a disability, then accessibility is not an issue for her, right? Like public spaces are only about safety at the most. But the idea is, how is accessibility not an issue for her? If you don't have pedestrian spaces to walk, she may not feel safe. If you don't have a space to cross over and then take a pause, she may not feel safe. So it's much more about the physical space as well. So bringing these two factors together was extremely interesting for us and brought out quite a few things. Women who were visually impaired, and I clearly remember this was our first year of the campaign in 2015, and we were walking on the Worli Sea Face or in the area around that, and this was in partnership with the visually impaired women from National Association for the Blind. And they just walked, and there were these foot-long protrusions from the ground, which were totally unnecessary on a couple of feet wide. If you looked at the standard, it was a pretty narrow footpath, and the women just, sometimes their canes encountered that obstacle, sometimes it didn't. And when you have an obstacle which is like about 2.5 feet tall, jutting out of the ground, which doesn't serve any purpose, it becomes unnecessarily obstructive. And the idea is, why? Why would we do that? When we're making footpaths, Mumbai rarely has footpaths. If we make them, we just don't make the curbs or the edges, in a fashion or reclined enough or inclined enough or smooth enough for wheelchairs to embark and disembark from the footpath. We have signals, red lights, traffic signals, where women, if they're disabled, and coming back to women with visual impairment, which also came up in that piece of our campaign, they were like, okay, we're forced to ask for help when we need to cross the road. Okay, so that's one thing, that if you don't have help, you can't cross the road if you're blind. The second thing is, it's not only about waiting around for help, but it's also that you make the woman with a visual impairment more dependent and thus more vulnerable to street abuse. I was training in one of the schools, and young girls, teenagers, again visually impaired, and I spoke to them and I said, have you ever faced street sexual harassment? And they said, no, we don't face street sexual harassment. And I said, okay, that's not right. It seems totally not right. And I asked them, okay, so let's break this down. Do you cross roads when you have to go to places? They said, yes. I said, okay, what do you do when you have to cross a road? They said, we ask for help. I said, okay, now that you ask for help, what happens? Do you get help easily? They're like, no, that's a problem, but that doesn't mean it's a street sexual harassment. I said, fair. Then I asked them, okay, so whenever people have helped you, it's been with best intentions. Have they never tried to sort of take advantage or touch you inappropriately? They paused and they said, yeah, but that happens all the time. That's not called sexual harassment. That's because we're disabled. And that was something that really, really moved me. That the infrastructure is such, which is something that's correctable, right? That's something that can be taken care of, is such that we are putting young girls in a situation where they're attributing harassment, abuse as an everyday living experience, as a trade-off that they have to pay if they're disabled. And that's a really disturbing outcome for me when it comes to access, gender rights, sexuality in public spaces. Combined with disability. We don't think about many of the things. The problem is when we again, as a part of our My Access campaign, were I think it was with Paraplegic Foundation, and we were trying to pair up, which we always do, disabled and non-disabled girls together to do a little safety audit of the area around. And many of the non-disabled girls who were helping wheelchair users or women on crutches, they found it extremely threatening when there was no proper zebra crossing, when the footpaths weren't right to get off at the red light or the traffic signal and cross the street. It was dangerous and it was scary for them. It wasn't just about not getting help to stop the cars, but it was almost a threat of being run down, because when there's no zebra crossing, when the rules are not strict, when infrastructure is not established to make space and visibility, to give that statement out to even car drivers, to traffic police, to all of them that, hey, listen, there are people with disabilities and they can occupy the space too. So we are creating these and you better respect it, right? So when we don't create such things, and the women on wheelchairs, assisted by non-disabled women, were even trying to cross streets or navigate crowded public spaces, they all were extremely scared. One of the women, again, and this was in collaboration with the organization Vishesh, when we were conducting a safety walk. So we generally, as a part of the My Access campaign, have a discussion, talk about safe and unsafe spaces, what access means to each of the women there, irrespective of disability, and then do the safety audit and then do a debrief. So in the when we were discussing what safety meant, a woman who was hearing impaired shared with us that it was a very narrow street where she was walking. There wasn't any space for pedestrian walking. There wasn't a footpath, and she was trying to sort of walk, and someone started honking from behind. There must have been a bigger car, and they started honking, and she couldn't hear, obviously, because she was hearing impaired. And she was hit and the man went away. These are the things. So when we try to create sort of sound signals, do we also see if we can have some kind of visual indication. When we only have visual indication, can we think of creating some kind of audio indications as well? Basically, this is not, sometimes people are like, ha, now you said visual, now we created visual, now for the visually impaired we have to create audio, and then for the wheelchair users we have to do this, and then with someone else we have to also do that. But what we forget is everyone is not, there's no binary. There are no these, we get confused. We say, okay, here's the disabled, here's the non-disabled, and there's nothing in between, right? And this is the biggest problem, because we are saying we're us and they're them. For them, how much can we change? How much can we adjust? It comes two major problems. One is that it comes with a very charity lens, saying we are doing something for them. But that's not what you're doing. You're just making a city inclusive. There's no us and there's no them. And you can't go and tell the citizens of India that we are building roads for you. It's such a big deal. Just be grateful. In the similar fashion, you can't go to people with disabilities and say, okay, we made these 2 train stations accessible. How much more do you want? Right? Or we made these 10 buildings accessible, which are the most used buildings in this city or most frequented buildings in this city. How many more buildings can we make accessible? So it's not about doing something for them with this charity approach of let's just do something and they'll be happy. The second big problem is this binary that I was talking about disabled, non-disabled. Now what happens with this binary is that we've forgotten something called temporarily abled bodies, which means tomorrow there is a non-disabled person. They have a fall, they break their legs, let's not break their back, they break their legs. For those 6 weeks, 8 weeks, 10 weeks, they're either on crutches, after the bed rest, they're either on crutches or on a wheelchair. Wouldn't they need it? Everybody's aging. There's no one who can claim that they're going backwards in age. They will have a body which will change. They will have a body which will morph, which will have needs. Where will they fit? Will they fit in disabled or non-disabled? They're non-disabled elderly people who will slowly move towards the category of being disabled. And so where are they when they're in between and when they need these services? So these two thoughts, if we eliminate the charity lens and we say it's a right, accessing public space, accessing these streets, being out there is a right of every individual. And when we say every, means every, with all diversities. When we say that and when we really think that and internalize that, that's when change will begin to happen. And the second step, and the second very, very major step, is to break this binary, this idea of a binary existence or two polarities where bodies stand once, or minds even stand. Once we break that, that's going to help as well. So I think some of the ways to change attitudes, to internalize diversity into urban planning, even for pedestrians, just to think, even for people who are into construction, to think about what's the access up to their building, what's the access up to their offices, what are they doing even within the infrastructures that they construct. That's also important, because many of those buildings are public spaces. They're banks, they're shopping malls, they're other things that people need to access. So it's not just about the streets, it's about everyone being very conscious. There's something very interesting because the idea of accessibility, once people internalize it and we say, okay, now we need to really change because it's everyone's right. If people go in this panic mode, which I hope they go in someday. So once you go in that mode, we will realize that accessibility is better to be inbuilt. So when you're starting stuff, it's going to be easier once we build it into our systems, into our minds, rather than look back every time and say, oh, let's correct this. Let's bring in disability experts and correct this, right? What I'm not trying to say don't bring in disability experts, but I'm just trying to say is let's build accessibility, or let's establish accessibility as a built-in features in our mind, or as a built-in feature of any new construction, of any public space, of anything that we encounter. The other thing is that once we also retrofit accessibility features, right? Like we go back and correct things. We also need to see that they're not tokenistic, to be very honest, because the easiest thing to do is, here are the stairs, let's build a ramp. Okay, I keep saying that ramp is not accessibility, but also, do you even bother to get the ramp right? So are we doing it tokenistically, or are we really getting it right? If you're going to have a steep ramp, there's no wheelchair in this world that can go up it, right? Or other than the wheelchairs that are doing like mountaineering, etc. So it's just what's our approach and what's our thinking is really, really important, because there will be one, understanding that there is a need, two, making that change or building it into your plans, third, seeing that it always remains. So for example, at the local train stations in Mumbai, there is a special handicap dabba in the trains, and generally where the handicap dabba would be or reach, you have these beepers, so then visually impaired people would know that this is the area where it's the handicap dabba, plus there is a signage. Of course, we're not talking about physical disability, because nothing about trains or local trains or stations is accessible when it comes to physical disability. So what happens is these beepers are installed, and then when they break down, there is no regulation. Like there's nobody monitoring that this is broken down. This will be replaced in, let's say, this will be replaced in 2 weeks, 1 week, 2 days. There is just no checks for implementation and sustainability. And that's something that's also very important to see, right? It's not only enough to say, okay, we are just putting this temporarily movable ramp and we are going away. It's not okay to do that. That also needs to be right. First, that ramp is not accessibility. Second, you need to still get that right. Third, you need to have some kind of checks going around, whether that's being maintained, what's the sustainability, what if something goes wrong. So these are a couple of things that we need to keep in mind. So we all know that in India, the Accessible India campaign was launched, which we thought was a fantastic initiative to start thinking about accessibility. Not that we were very happy with the timing, because it's not in 2015 that you start thinking about accessibility, but that's not about this government. It's just been years that accessibility has not been the top agenda for people with disabilities. So we were pretty sort of excited about the campaign when it started, etc. Looking at the pace and looking at where it's not moving and what it's not doing has been a very frustrating process. Also, that when I say we were excited that there was an Accessible India campaign, in the disability community, we've somehow, rights are so lacking so many times that we end up many a times saying at least something's happening. Even the campaign that was launched was a very ambitious campaign, but was not enough. Because what do we do by just making X number of government buildings accessible? Why don't we have a very stringent building code which will be heavily penalized if people who are into construction do not follow it, right? So there were a lot of gaping holes saying, okay, fine, you'll make these government buildings accessible. What will happen then? How will you make this transport accessible? In Mumbai, if you ask me, I can't see a way they could shut down the whole local train system and make an accessible one in its place. Sure, they're making metros, but those are not the same routes as the local train station is taking. And there's no way in the current scenario that the trains and the stations can be quickly made accessible. And I don't think that enough thought was put into that. So if I look at the campaign overall, it was an ambitious effort. First step, so we all got excited. Not enough. We as activists and people with disabilities had to be like, okay, at least someone started. But again, the pace isn't there, the rhythm isn't there, the outcomes are most certainly not there. And what we struggle is with daily life as people with disabilities, as women with disabilities, to say, okay, how do we then just navigate? how do we then navigate a day? How do we then navigate being in an educational institution? How can I be confident of, I am a wheelchair user, how can I be confident of reaching a hospital on my own, entering that, taking my mom who's in emergency on my own? So there are very everyday questions. There is one that there's a larger policy dialogue, and then there are people with disabilities who are struggling with everyday questions. And the problem is that we're making them struggle even more. There's this thing where everyone who's disabled is called inspirational. It's a very standard thing that non-disabled people do to us. They say, you are a person with a disability and you're here, you're so inspiring, we are amazed. And there was a TED talk by Stella Young saying, I'm not your inspiration, thank you very much. Because all of us generally who are, all of us who are disabled are generally sort of slightly like, yeah, there you go again, of course we are inspirational, da 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 da. But I would always joke and tell people, maybe we are inspirational because there are so many extra challenges thrown at people with disabilities living in India that it's not even funny. And they are expected to combat it. They're expected to overcome daily negotiations, which people don't even think twice about. How many people think about before going for a walk in the morning? How many people have to plan to reach a railway station? How many people have to struggle to put money aside because buses, railway stations, auto rickshaws, taxis are not accessible with their physical disability? And so they either have to own a car or have to go through struggles for getting into a taxi at the most. But there is no cheap public transport available. How many of the people have to feel inconfident about accessing public buildings, saying, okay, oh my God, if there's something, I might not be able to take my family to the health emergency, or maybe I will have to plan 10 extra minutes to reach the bank because the path to the bank and outside of the bank and inside, nothing's accessible. We're taking people with disabilities for granted. We're taking their time, their effort, their energy, all of these things for granted. Being or living with a disability is already challenging enough in an ableist world, and we're adding a whole layer of challenges without blinking an eye. And that again brings me back to something that I said earlier, is what is the message that we're trying to give? That people with disabilities are not people enough for us to care? Are people with disabilities not important citizens? Are people with disabilities expected to be dependent? Are people with disabilities just existing to sit back at home, live in a cocoon and never step out? What are we trying to say and what are we trying to do is something that all of us should question ourselves and think about. So I remember when I started working for girls and women with disabilities, one of the senior activists said that when she started working for girls and women with disabilities, she's also disabled. And she said, when I started talking about their rights and saying how women's movement and disability movement and all these different movements are not looking at girls and women with disabilities, someone challenged her, saying, but where are they? They're not visible. They don't come out only. We have meetings, they don't come to the meeting, etc., etc. We're starting a vicious cycle here. Maybe a lot of people with disabilities are not visible because we don't allow them to be visible, because we create so many barriers on the streets, in public spaces, in public buildings, in just buildings, in meeting spaces, that they can't get visible. And because they're not visible, they're further invisibilized. So we're also activating a whole chain of invisibility, of a whole chain of silencing voices, a whole chain of restriction when it comes to people with disabilities, by being inaccessible, by being non-inclusive, and by being insensitive towards diverse bodies and minds. I was really excited when the Why Loiter campaign started, because it said, what's the point? Do you think public space only belongs to men? No, public spaces belong to women too. And I very happily joined the campaign, because I say public spaces belong to everybody. And somehow that got me thinking even more. I can never think of a public space being a space for someone with a disability to just hang around, to just loiter, because we're not even creating that space, that basic access for them to perform their daily activities. For us, everyone will attack me saying, now you're saying people with disabilities are them. But for all of us, for them, for people with diversities, for me who's also diverse, right? For people who are different, who are diverse, who move differently, who navigate spaces differently, what are we doing? Are we creating that access? Are we creating that right to negotiate these spaces on a daily basis for loitering, for fun, for hanging around? That's a question, again, for us to think and ponder, because space or a public space does not only belong to you. It does not only belong to me. It belongs to all of us. And that's something that we need to remember.